Welcome, everyone. You are on the Radical Moderate podcast with Pat O'Brien. And this week, we're going to be talking about the American primary education system. So let me define that for you real quick. Talking about kindergarten through 12th grade, talking about primarily public school, but also to some extent private school. But I'm not talking about pre-K. I'm not talking about colleges, community colleges, that what most of us would call school. In fact, when I say most of us, I mean most Americans, because most Americans don't go past high school in terms of their education. The majority of Americans stop at high school, and possible they might take a year of community college, or they might go get some certification, but they do not, for the most part, go get a college education. So K through 12 is where everybody gets educated. Now, let's talk about some big picture stats and to some extent a little bit of historical context. There's about 50 million students in public schools right now, another 5 million or so in private schools. So around about 55 million total in a country of 340 million people. So it's a massive number of people. It's also, in terms of the consequences to our society, to our economy, it's a huge job. And we know that's the case. And if you do polling to say how important education is, everybody's going to put it right there at the top. But our understanding of the education system and our approach to it, I think, is very dated in many regards. And so how do we fund education? If you don't know, education, public education is primarily funded at the state and local level, and more so the local level, usually property taxes. In my home state of Arkansas, that's the case. Your property taxes is the main way in which schools get funding, and that's funding for their teachers, funding for their buildings, etc. So if you live in a community that's affluent, where the real estate value is pretty high, you're going to have better school buildings. You're going to be able to pay your teachers a little bit more, everyone, support staff, etc. On the flip side of that, if you live in an area where your real estate pricing is not as good, not as affluent, maybe even impoverished, it's going to be much harder for you to fund your schools. Now, most states, and again, my home state of Arkansas, there's some equalization of that at the state level, that there's basic things that need to be provided for. So that's the state and local funding. And then there is a role for the federal government. It's actually pretty small, less than 10% typically of funding of schools comes from the federal government, and it tends to be in very specific things. So I'm not going to have a big focus on what the federal government does, except for if you have federal courts involved. And we go back to Brown versus Board of Education. Separate but equal is inherently unequal, meaning that schools have to be integrated. That was a massive decision. And then the future cases which were trying to implement that had a big role in education. So to make this personal, to start off with, I grew up in a town called Jacksonville, Arkansas. It's part of the Pulaski County School District. Jacksonville was a bit unique in Arkansas because it was an Air Force community. You had kids from all around the world who were going to school with each other. The kids of military folks tend to be pretty disciplined, and it was a good mix. And I went to a school not really understanding that was not the typical Southern experience, where schools were much more segregated, because our public school was very much integrated. Now, having said that, there were certain reasons for that. In the early 1980s, there was a federal court case called a desegregation case that was implemented for Pulaski County, and it had some strange, bizarre consequences for it. So, for example, in K through 6th grade, I just went to school with the kids that lived generally in my neighborhood and made friendships. When I got to junior high, which at that time was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, we were divided up not by where we live, but by the last letter of our name. So there was a place called South Side, A through J, went to South Side. There was a place called North Side, K through Z, went to North Side. I'm in O, I went to North Side. And interestingly, most of my friends, just by luck of the draw, happened to go to the other school. And so while I didn't like it at all, it did force me to become friends with new people. But they did that so the schools would be integrated. And when I was a teenager, I didn't like it at all. I see the logic behind it now and how we got there. Because basically, if you want to take a look at the historical role of the federal government, it really starts with Brown versus the Board of Education, which essentially told every public school district in the country, you have to integrate your schools. You can't have a white school and a black school. Well, as you might imagine, some people were like, we're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to ignore the ruling, or maybe nobody will come and enforce the ruling. So you go through the 1960s and then certainly in the early 1970s, and you have other federal court rulings which say hey, Brown versus Board of Education, which was a 9-0 ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court, says you have to integrate your schools. And we federal courts don't want to be in charge of schools, but if you don't take us seriously and you don't do this yourself, we'll end up doing it for you. And that's exactly what happened in Pulaski County Special School District, where I grew up. And it happened at school districts around the country. And it's a shame because the federal courts aren't any good at running anything, as you might imagine. But to their in their defense, they didn't want to. They signaled to defendants in the case, school districts in the case, and really school boards and communities, you need to get your act together or we'll do it for you. And a lot of people picked the door of, well, you can do it for us. And then nobody liked that. So that kind of brings us up to this modern days of, schools have been integrated a long time ago in the public sector, but then things changed, meaning some people who didn't want to go, they didn't want to have integrated schools, or that's not what they would say typically, but that's the reality. They want to be part of integrated schools with their kids. So they went to private schools if they could afford them. If they couldn't afford private schools, sometimes they would move to a community that was not part of a desegregation case. That certainly happened all across the country, happened near where I lived. And then whole communities sprung up where it's essentially segregated again. And even though it's not violating a court order anymore. And that's kind of how the public education system develops. So that gets you to just kind of how did we get here? Now, when you want to talk about education, like I'm going to do today, I'm going to give you two big things about public primary education in this country that I think don't work, or at least massive challenges that need to be overcome. The first is governance, like who governs the school district. Well, that would be your local school board. And I'm going to come right back to that in a second. The second thing is, what's the model? So a radical moderate says, whether it's politics or business and public policy, a radical moderate looks at a situation and says, what's the model? Like, what's the economic model? What's the incentive model? What's the math behind all of this? And if you look at public education, you're going to quickly realize it's very customer centric. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you're 5 years old, you're incredibly needy. You need basic structure, you need food, you need naps, you need attention, and of course you need schooling. You need to be educated. So as a customer, you're incredibly needy. And no one knows that better than the parents of the 5-year-old, who, quite frankly, a lot of times are just very happy to send the 5-year-old to a school and get them out of the house and help somebody sharing the burden of taking care of this kid. But it's very customer centric. And as you go along, the human mind, so what the customer part of this is, the student is the customer and the product is education, but everybody comes at it differently. If you're 10 years old, you don't know what your curriculum should be, and you really shouldn't have a say in it. Versus if you're 30 years old and you're on Amazon and you want to get the best price and best value for a product, that's an easy economic model to understand. But when the education system, the customer often doesn't know what they want, doesn't know what's in their best interest. There's divergent opinions of what's in their best interest, and it's a mess. Now, I would argue to you, schools should be focused on teaching critical thinking as opposed to like rote knowledge. I mean, we have the internet, we have Wikipedia, we've had books for a long time. There, you can get the knowledge pretty. We have AI, obviously, is becoming very prevalent. I'm starting to use it myself to help solve problems. There's a lot of ways to get the knowledge, but you got to have the critical thinking skills, and those two things do go hand in hand. But that's just the first silo, if you will, or first way to look at public education is you've got a customer. What's the model to deliver the product to that customer? And there's a whole lot of opinions about it, which leads me into my second topic or broad way to look at public education, which is the governance. So maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but all school districts in this country are actually governed by school boards. And I was actually on one of those school boards. From 1999 to 2003, I was on the Pulaski County Special School District Board, which is the same school district of which I was a student. So I had a lot of familiarity with it. I tell people I didn't have to serve in Vietnam, but I did serve 4 years on the Pulaski County School Board. It was not a good experience. It was not a fun experience for just a variety of reasons. I think I was kind of tricked into it. I wanted some people in my local community. They said, Pat, you like politics, you're a hard worker, you're a community guy and all that. Take this job. And I took it, and my board had 7 members, and I'll just kind of give you some broad strokes here. A lot of short-term thinking. So we had 18,000 students in this district. It kind of made a donut around Pulaski County. So there was Little Rock, which is home to Little Rock Central, the famous high school that was part kind of going back to the days of Brown versus the Board of Education. There's North Little Rock, and then Pulaski County Special kind of made a donut around those two communities. So you had different communities, in different parts of the county that didn't have a whole lot in common, didn't have the same goals. So you're, from a political standpoint, you were set up for an adversarial relationship, and that is what you got. And so I saw a lot of short-term thinking on there. Even worse, there was cronyism. I'm not going to name names, but there was at least one school member who had multiple family members on who worked for the school district. So this board member is there to govern the district, and then had 4, 5, maybe 6 family members who had various kind of jobs that were essentially protected as long as that person was on the school board. So that wasn't good to have, because now you've got people who've got conflicts of interest making a decision for 18,000 students. And then the way that we even elect a school board. So, and the laws have changed on this in some places, but for the most part, school board members are elected in special elections that are very low turnout. They don't get a lot of attention, and so they kind of fly under the radar. And that's not good, because it's one of the most important jobs. I truly believe that like a school board member many times can have more power than even sometimes like a United States congressperson, especially given the gridlock that we have in Washington, D.C. And so, in short, the incentives of a school board are bad. The economic incentive model is bad. It's a thankless job. You don't get paid. I remember one time I had a constituent call, and he was upset about something, and he didn't know how the school district was funded. He didn't know that his property taxes paid for it. He was angry, and I listened to him, and then he didn't like my answer. So I think at the end of the conversation, he's like, I'm going to petition to get your salary cut. And I said, well, my salary, sir, is 0. So I don't, it's going to be 0 after you make your big push, but go for it. Do whatever you want to do. And my experience, again, going back to, just how I view these things, is that my school district had a teachers union. Not every school district, especially if you're smaller, has a teachers union. There's nothing inherently wrong, in my opinion, with a union anywhere. That can be a very good thing to influence and protect people. But my experience with the teachers union in Pulaski County was bad. And I believe that I tried to work with them all the time. I was always an open line of communication. You could, move me with facts and figures. And I used to tell them that 70% of the time we agree on what the path forward needs to be. But on the 30% of things that we didn't agree upon, they treated me like public enemy number one. I remember there was a big vote coming up on it. It was essentially they wanted higher pay for teachers, which everybody wants, but we had a budget and we had also, a budget that you had to live within. And then there'd been an attempt to raise taxes through a millage increase. The voters had resoundingly said no to. And I just said, we can only do so much. Instead of like trying to move me with facts and figures and data, the union went straight to political pressure. It was all about, hey, if you don't vote the way we want you to, we're going to kick you off the school board. We're going to run somebody against you. So that's fine. I mean, like run somebody against me. And I ended up not running again anyways, but I wasn't afraid of that at all. But then it turned, and I'm not even kidding, it turned in, we're going to boycott your McDonald's. So if you know my background, my dad was a McDonald's franchisee. When he passed away, I took over the business for a while. And at that time, when I was on the school board, I was running our family business, the McDonald's. And so there was actually supposedly a boycott of McDonald's. Well, it didn't work out at all. Our sales were up like 5% during the time period of which we were supposedly boycotted. But that gave you an example of, instead of like, hey, win me over, persuasively with good arguments, it was all about political pressure. And I ignored that. But it was a very bad experience, both with the union, with the structure of the school board itself. There were several times where I would try to bring some innovation into the school district, and the votes were usually 6-1 or 5-2, and I was on the losing side. It was in the worst case, and then I'll kind of move on to the customers, the students. But in the worst case, I can say of where the school board didn't work at all, the union was mandated that if you were a member of the union, if you were a teacher and you're a member of the union, they had to provide you a lawyer and defend your job no matter what. We actually had a teacher come up in front of our board who the principal wanted gone from the school. And this guy was smoking in the classroom in front of the students. And this came out and it was unequivocal. Witnesses, and he had said that, and then he finally, when I was questioning him at his hearing, he finally admitted it, and clearly violating all the rules of the school. And he got to keep his job. He got a stern warning. But I mean, it was symbolic that no one ever got fired. There were over 1,000 teachers in the Pulaski County School District, and I inquired one time, how many people got fired in a 5-year period? And the answer was 0. 0 teachers got fired in a 5-year period. Now, don't get me wrong. We had a lot of great teachers, but just like any business that's got over 1,000 employees, you're going to have some bad employees. You couldn't fire anyone. And that was indicative of a bad system that I'm quite sure is prevalent across the United States. Now, let's go back for a second and talk about the good old days, right? When the education system in the United States of America was kind of the envy of the world. So how did that happen? Like what were the circumstances for that? Well, first off, if you go back 100 years, this country really created the structure that all other countries around the world wanted to follow, which was mandatory education, eventually K through 12. And it worked so well that countries across the world started adopting it. Here, though, we had an advantage in the United States, and that was we had amazing teachers. And so you're thinking about the 1940s coming right out of the war, the 1950s, definitely in the 1960s, and it starts changing in the 1970s and certainly in the 1980s. But we had the best teachers. Why? Why did we have the best teachers? Because they were almost all female. And why were they all female in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and to some extent the 70s? they didn't have any other opportunities. So if you were a woman in the 1960s, being a teacher was a great job to have. You were most likely married and your husband was the big, moneymaker in the house. You probably had some children. So you had to split duties between being a teacher and the children. And you couldn't be a doctor, a lawyer, an architect, an engineer. Those jobs were not available. I hope, especially for young women today, I hope they know their history. But those opportunities didn't exist for women back during that time period. So they went to teaching because that's what you could do, or they went to nursing. My mom was a nurse, but that's why we had the best education system, is because we had, from an employment standpoint, a captive employment pool. So the best and brightest women all went and became teachers. But then over time, as they had more choices, they started making those choices. And being a lawyer or an architect, an engineer, you can get paid a lot more, and diversity of what you're working on, et cetera. So now, we have lots of male teachers and still lots of female teachers, but we're not getting the best and brightest from an overall standpoint, like the top level students, the way that we were at this point 60 years ago. That's a problem, which means that you then have to change your system. And now that's where I want to talk about like solutions. And I'm not going to do a deep dive today on just statistics. You can Google them yourselves, but we lag as a country. We lag in a lot of the core test scores and things that by any metric you would judge a great education system. And again, if you go back 60 years, we were top shelf on all that stuff, but now we're not, and we've lagged behind. And I would say it's because we haven't changed our ways. We haven't changed our model. And the whole, thought process behind being a radical moderate is you got to look at a problem from a fact-based standpoint. And if something's not working, you have to change it. So what is it that we want in education? Well, all studies really show that the biggest influence in the education of a student is the teacher. Duh. Everybody understands that. I mean, what your support system at home, your parents, that has a big influence too. But especially if you don't have a great influence in terms of your parents, then the teacher becomes even that much more important. So we need high-level teachers. And just to explain real quick how it works in almost every public school district in the country, teachers are paid essentially on a grid. And that on one part of that grid is how many years they've worked there. Another part of that grid is their education level. But all teachers are going to have an undergraduate. So they're all starting at that level, but you can get a graduate degree, you can get a PhD, and that'll bump you up a little bit. But it's really, if you stay longer, you get paid more. And that's fine up until a point. But let's go back to the customer, the 5-year-old, the 10-year-old. They need a lot of attention. They're exhausting to deal with, especially, again, if they come to school not prepared to learn and with behavioral issues, especially from impoverished communities. And so that teacher's job is that much harder. And so, think about, like, if you're a movie person like I am, the best stories are things like Freedom Riders, the story of a teacher in California who opens up the minds of students in kind of a underserved and impoverished community to write diaries and to become writers themselves. Another one, Stand and Deliver, a calculus teacher in Southern California who overcomes all odds to get his students to pass the AP test. And you can go on and on. The commonality there is the teacher is amazing. Like, they're the Michael Jordan of teaching. And that's really what it's going to take to educate somebody at a high level, especially if they start off, behind the 8 ball. And that is not the system we have. The economic incentive model that we have in public education is not designed to attract those people. You can make a lot more money doing other professions. And don't get me wrong, we pay teachers a lot more now than we used to, and they do have, time off in the summer, but it doesn't really equal out to the opportunities that they have, men or women. It's just that women used to be, the high percentage of teachers were female. And now it's much more balanced. And I would say to you that what we need in public education, to kind of cut to the chase, is we need to get away from the tenure system, and we need to get into the results system. We need to have metrics to show that if you can teach someone and you can move a student's educational level forward very rapidly, you should be paid more, whether you're first, second, third year teacher versus if you're a 20, 25-year teacher. I get that if you do something for 25 years, you're going to have a lot of wisdom and that sort of thing. I fully understand that, but it doesn't exist anywhere else. And what I mean by that, like if you're a great lawyer and you've been doing it for 5 years, there's nothing that says you can't make as much money as somebody who's been doing it for 30, because there's a free market system that just says eventually the clients who get to choose the lawyer, that they will pick the best one for them, the hardest working. A brand new lawyer might work harder, might be willing to give more time and attention to their client, to their customer in this case. And that's the same thing that a teacher may do, because if you're 5 years old, more than you need somebody with 20 years experience and a PhD, you need somebody who cares. You need somebody who's willing to put in the hours. And if you look at those movies, and I can go on and on about them, but just go back to Stand and Deliver, there's so much extra time that the teacher's putting into these kids that's paying off. And that both from the standpoint of the student sees that they're cared for as an individual, but also from the standpoint of just learning, because you can't fake calculus. You can't, what they did in Stand and Deliver, what the teacher did there, you can't fake that. And you either pass or you don't. You either know it or you don't. And so teacher tenure, I understand how we got here, but the whole world has changed to where, just think about it. Who wants to stay with any job for 20 years anymore? I don't. I don't want to be stuck in the same job for 20 years. And I don't think that the best minds that are coming out of college right now want to think about, I've got to do this for 20 years before I can make a decent amount of money. And you get health benefits and you get some retirement. But if you look at the economics of it, it doesn't add up. And so what we know to be true, and this is just one example that I'm talking about this week with public education, and how we need to think of things in a much more radical nature, but things that really make sense. The premise I'm throwing at you this week is, let's start treating public education the way we treat other types of industries: architecture, engineering, coding. My wife is an IT professional. If you're good at your job, you should be able to advance as high and as fast as you want to. And if you're not good at your job, sometimes you need to get fired. You need to get pushed out. It's really a disgrace that the school board that I was a part of had to report to me that over a 5-year period with over 1,000 teachers, not one of them was fired for cause. It doesn't make any sense. It defies logic. And then when I would raise the questions about it, I would get pushback from the union of like, "Oh, you're anti-teacher." I'm like, "No, I'm pro-student." And I'm not for bad employees. And just like any other, bell curve, you're going to have people who are great at their job, most in the middle, which is where we're going to run the world, and then people on the other side where they're just not any good at the job and they need to move on. And so, being a radical moderate means you got to be anchored in the truth. Public education is in desperate need of innovation. And I can tell you, certainly I've done a lot of research in it, but my 4 years on a school board, I'd be interested to know from people who also served on school boards, if their experience was similar to mine. It was pretty awful of what I saw. And more than anything, it was status quo. It was, well, this is how we've done it, and we're a large bureaucracy and we don't want to change. And if you just think about what we're talking about, 55 million students per year going through this system, and they're doing it for 13 years. We want to teach them to have critical thinking skills so they can be an educated voter and citizen and community member. We want them to drive us into the future, economically competitive. It's way, 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 way too big of a sector for us to just say bureaucracy is good enough. So thanks again for joining the Radical Moderate podcast this week and listening to the POV of POB.